Welcome to Alas, Vine and Hitchens. I am Sarah Vine.
And I am Peter Hitchens.
And on this week's episode, Peter going nuclear, something that you do frequently on this show, I'd say.
Absolutely.
And also, I would like to talk about the time limit on abortions. Join us after the break. Welcome to Alas, Vine and Hitchens. I'm Sarah Vine.
And I am Peter Hitchens.
And we asked for your email, and you did not disappoint. If you would like to get involved, please email us your questions or your book or your viewing suggestions at alas@mailonline.co.uk. To our first letter. I'm reading this one, Peter. Hi, Sarah and Peter. I'm loving the podcast, and as much as I think he would hate to hear it, I have been a super fan of Peter for as long as I have been able to think for myself. Alas, I am only 25, so that is only about a decade, although at 13 my uncle did say to me, "You're far too cynical for a child." Is this one of your long-lost children, Peter, do you think?
I don't believe I have any long-lost children, unless it's something you wish to break to me.
Anyway, he says, I enjoyed your conversation on university essays conforming to the same patterns. It is very much connected to my generation being taught what to think and not how to think. I did my dissertation on the relatively niche subject of medieval hell. That's not niche, by the way. I did a lot of that at university.
Well, the fact that you did it doesn't mean it's not niche.
Subject. And received a good mark for it, which goes contrary to the idea that people my age do not write interesting dissertations for fear of a bad mark. The real reason is, as you both correctly noticed, my generation cultivate moral superiority by adhering to groupthink. I met a lot of people at university, and the titles of their dissertations almost always follow the following pattern. Women/queer people in the insert any time period, and how they were treated badly by the patriarchy/racist/Christians. All very dull and pointless. Anyway, keep up the good fight. That's from James. I love that letter.
Yes, thank you, James. It all seems very familiar, but I'm glad you wrote about hell. An under-discussed subject of which it was once quite rightly said that whenever any society attempts to abolish hell, it tends to arise in our midst very quickly. This is from Patrick, and it's Dear Sarah and Peter. As a young man just out of university, I entirely recognise what Sarah's children said about writing their essays and dissertations, whereby any deviant thought is actively punished. He says this was most obvious in his own English classes, and a particular moment when he was 14 was exposed in all its reality to him. We were made to study J.B. Priestley's and Inspector calls for our GCSE. And I said in one of my essays, Priestley is trying to make an argument for socialism. And after it had been marked, my teacher said to me, you can't say Priestley is trying to argue for socialism, because it suggests he might be failing. In my naivety, I answered, but he is failing. It's a bad argument made badly. And then the killer blow came. My teacher said, you can't say that he's failing because you'll get marked down in the exam. This, he points out, was after Michael Gove's education reforms, in which the mark scheme was supposedly rewarded critical analysis. This experience gave me a hatred of reading. It seems to be the wrong reaction to me, I have to say. You just read something else, from which it took me 3 years to recover. I'm glad you recovered, but you're right when you say the education system pays lip service to critical and original thinking, but whenever anyone tries it, they're immediately punished with low grades. Hence, he confesses, in the real exam, I gave the required opinion for a good mark, as I suspect many thousands of others do, much in the way that people used to do their Marxism-Leninism classes in Eastern Europe.
Both Patrick and James are basically this is the problem, is that we're teaching young people to lie effectively to get where they need to get to. How awful is that?
But that's what the old communist countries used to do. There were endless Marxism-Leninism classes which you had to attend. Angela Merkel, in her memoir, which I struggled through a few weeks ago, was actually the one time she got in serious trouble in the old East Germany was when she was caught doing her homework in another subject during a Marxism-Leninism lecture. Somebody looked over her shoulder and denounced her for it.
Wow.
That tells you what that kind of life is like. It's not very far from where we are now, but it's, as I say, it's done in a marshmallow way rather than an iron-clad way.
Yes, I love that term. Another one from Fiona. I love your podcast. I would be very interested to hear more about Peter's views on Iran and also Northern Ireland. I would also like to hear more about his travels around Iran/Persia.
Gosh, it's probably not the time to do either of them now, but if you go to the Peter Hitchens blog, which is still available, there's masses of stuff on it. Best to look for it, I have to say, not on Google, but on a search engine called DuckDuckGo, which isn't so prejudiced against me. But you will find masses of stuff about Northern Ireland, including an essay on why it's so totally obvious that the IRA won. There also are 2 long episodes of the diary I kept while I was in Persia, or Iran, as people now like to call it, but back, I think 18 years ago now. And also, I think there you will find the article which I wrote and which was published in the Mail on Sunday, which give you a pretty good idea of what I think. I would add, though, that my guide and mentor and translator during that trip, Jason Rezaian, was arrested falsely on charges of spying not long after I went there, and this has also greatly coloured my view of that country. And we also have a letter from Elvis Nagash. He says, after a conversation, perhaps more like an argument with a friend, I was wondering what our opinion was on the relaxing of historical accuracy in media, such as the relatively recent Napoleon film. He argued that by leaning into or taking inspiration from the more mythological elements of history, a wider range of people are introduced to history which they otherwise would have been ignorant of. I'm quite sympathetic to your opponent, actually. I think anything which gets people to look up what really happened is probably a good thing. You don't expect big Hollywood movies to be totally accurate about anything or everything. And as long as they don't actually tell blatant lies about the outcome and the nature, I don't mind it so much. It's drama, for goodness sake. Shakespeare's accounts of the Wars of the Roses aren't totally historically accurate, but my goodness, they're powerful and full of lessons. And if you want to know, the history is still there. So I think there should be some license, because after all, in the end, a film is entertainment.
I actually agree. I mean, I can see that it's irritating if you are a historian because you can see all the mistakes. But I do think it's sort of, if it brings people in, it brings people in. And, you've got to bring these things to life somehow.
I've read a lot of history because I wanted to find out whether
truth,
novels or films have been true. And I think it's a stimulus. I don't think as long as people understand that it's not a documentary, then that's okay.
Exactly.
But I hate it when documentaries lie.
Yes, quite. Final one, Hazel. Alas, they should not remove the time limit on abortions. At some point, we must draw a line, otherwise we risk facing scenarios where termination could be considered on the day of birth. The limit is 24 weeks. If it was up to me, it would be 14. The problem? Society often promotes sexual freedom without adequately discussing the consequences or responsibilities that will fall on the woman. Look at the messaging around any type of contraception advert. It is all me, my life, or I can sort it after. I know the difficult decisions you have to make if you're unhappily pregnant, but kicking the can down the road isn't going to help the situation. And abortion shouldn't be used as a form of contraception anyway, which it often is. I've always thought that no one else should have control over another person's body. I still think that, but when you become pregnant, it's not just about you. Really glad I found your podcast. Came for Peter, but I think you're great too, Sarah. Keep up the good work. Thank you, Hazel. Well, this was actually my topic for the week, the time limit on abortions.
Let's go.
So I think we will move into that. I mean, I have to say, I thought last week was one of the more depressing weeks we've had in recent history in Parliament because it was bookended by death at both ends. At the beginning, they voted to effectively decriminalise abortion up to the date of birth for the mother. And then at the end of the week, the assisted dying bill went through. We're not talking about the assisted dying, but the abortion thing really upset me because for number one, I don't think it's necessary. I think the current abortion law as it stands is not perfect, but it's adequate. I mean, there's never a perfect solution to these problems. You're always trying to terminate a human life. But the way it works at the moment is, I think, is about as good as it can get. The idea that we're decriminalising the killing of a fetus up to 40 weeks in order that a fraction, a tiny number of women do not get prosecuted is absurd.
Just a second. When you see somebody pushing a pushchair or a pram along the street and there's a tiny person in it recently born, do you say, oh gosh, what a lovely fetus?
No.
No, you say, what a lovely baby,
exactly.
Don't you? Why is it that when they're in the womb, they become a Latin word?
Well, exactly.
And we refer to them in English when they're out of the womb. Well, do you think? I think I know.
What do you think?
Well, if you can dehumanize somebody before you kill them, then it's easier to kill them.
Of course.
And I think the use of the word fetus is a mass dehumanization. I refuse to fall in with these babies.
That's a very good point.
And life begins at conception, and everything else thereafter, unless violently interrupted, is a process towards the same end.
I mean, there are, women do have miscarriages. Life does not always succeed. It's complicated.
Miscarriages are involuntary.
Well, yes, okay. As I said, there's no perfect solution to this issue. I'm sure there are people like you who think that life begins at conception and it is sacred.
It's not what I think. It's an absolute impossibility for anybody who understands the sciences to come up with any other time at which you can say definitively life is absent or present. That is the moment at which life begins.
Well, these are the mysteries of the universe. We don't really understand them, do we? And we can't understand them.
There is no other point at which you can say objectively that life begins apart from conception. The moment the moment the baby is conceived, the life has begun, and by interrupting it, you're therefore interrupting a life.
Correct. So I got very upset about this last week because I was slightly different from you. A compromise is necessary, and I think that fundamentally women do have agency over their body, but there does come a point, and I suppose what you're saying is
somebody else's body. You have perfect, complete agency over your body, but this is somebody else's body.
But
it's not your body in an abortion that gets destroyed.
No, it's not. But if you're talking about an abortion at, say, for example, 2 days, which could be the morning after pill, that is for me very different from an abortion at 40 weeks. I know maybe that's not how you feel.
I don't think anyone could argue it's different.
Right.
But the fundamental principle of what's going on is the same.
Yes, absolutely. You're terminating that life.
You're prepared to end a life for reasons generally of personal convenience.
But you're ending a life when it's
also compromise. People talk about compromise. The 1967 Act, on which everything is currently based, isn't really a compromise. We had a compromise before. Thousands of legal abortions took place in the National Health Service before 1967. Did you know that?
No.
No, people don't. It was based on a court case, 1938, involving a doctor called Alec Bourne, who was confronted by a mother who brought her 14-year-old girl into his surgery and said she's been raped by 4 soldiers just off Whitehall. It happened in 1938. And I think that if this baby goes to term, she will go mad. She's totally distressed. And he agreed, although he was actually against abortion, he agreed to perform the act. He then went and reported himself to the police. And he and his lawyer came up with the defence that what he did was justified under these very appalling circumstances. He was then acquitted. It happened during a conference of the British Medical Association, and they all rose as one man, as they pretty much all were at that time, and applauded the verdict for his acquittal. And that was the basis of abortion law from 1938 to 1967. There's a false belief that abortion was banned for intervening years. It just simply is not true. A number of other myths, which
So what is the difference between that and what happened in 1967?
Well, what happened in 1967 is that it was drawn so loosely that, as we now know, abortion is effectively on demand.
On demand, yeah, okay.
There's a sort of formula you go through where two doctors have to say that it's too distressing and therefore the abortion has to go ahead. But everybody knows this is an empty formality, and they will always say yes. And as a result, we've had since 1967, do you know how many abortions in this country?
I think you said in the last podcast, actually.
10 million. More than 10 million. I think it's 10.6. And the numbers go up every year. Now, it's extraordinary because a lot of the argument in 67 was about, well, one of the reasons why we have so much abortion is that contraception is very hard to get hold of, which in those days, by comparison with now, it was. People who weren't married struggled to get the pill and other forms of contraception.
The pill doesn't always
embarrassing
work.
And difficult to attend. They also said, of course, there's no sex education, really. We have to introduce sex education in schools. Now, as far as I can tell, the schools don't do very much else apart from sex education. And contraception is thrust at you. You can get it for nothing, right up to the morning after pill. All these things could be completely turned over, and yet the number of abortions go up every year. They don't go down.
I think
so. Those things were obviously not, whatever the reason is why people were having abortions. It isn't that sex education was absent or that contraception wasn't available. So something else is going on here.
I think what's going on here is that people don't take sex very seriously anymore. So it's a completely different sort of, it's not a thing that happens within a certain framework. It's just a thing that happens on its own. And I think that's a kind of moral question, but it's also just a societal, cultural thing. I mean, people have sex from the ages of 13, 14, and you don't understand anything at that age, do you? And I think they think that if they get pregnant, they can fix it. And often the boys don't take any responsibility or aren't there, or they don't even know who the father is. I mean, we're living in a society where there are no I mean, you could argue that the kind of moral framework that existed around sex was too strict. Now I would say it's probably much too lax. The pendulum has swung the other way.
For whom?
Well, I mean, if, for example, in a situation where you're married and you have no access to contraception and you're just having endless babies, and then you end up having far too many and you can't cope, that's not a good thing. There are always extenuating circumstances.
That's been the case at any point in recent history.
I think that's
even
not true.
Even in the early 60s, married people were able to obtain contraception.
Yes, but if it doesn't work and you have a child and you have another child that you don't want or you can't have for whatever reason, I mean, there are a lot of people...
So what about adoption as an alternative?
Well, I agree. Adoption is something that we should talk about, but I would say that there are a lot of people who have children who should not have children and who would be better off not having children. Okay, so if you are a sort of hopeless drug addict, or if you're an alcoholic, or if you're in an abusive relationship, or if you're, life is not perfect, Peter. So, these are all least bad solutions. I mean, for example, the sister of a friend of mine years ago got terribly hooked on drugs and ended up essentially working as a prostitute for her pimp. And she just kept getting pregnant, and she would have these babies and they would be taken away from her and they would be addicted to heroin, and it was a disaster, and they had all sorts of problems. And, a woman like that, it would be better if she didn't have a baby, generally speaking, because she's not able to look after it. It's not going to grow up in a happy, healthy environment. I don't know quite how
you set up a tribunal which
but there are social reasons.
Puts a label on someone saying she can't have a baby. I think it's probably impossible.
But the point is that
trying to deal with is the fact that in any large urbanized society there are going to be
exactly.
Though I would say that once the force of Christian morality and the importance, the unique privileges of marriage which used to exist, and the strong disapproval of people who had children outside marriage which used to exist, when these vanish, you're going to have a much more sexually chaotic society than you had before, and that is what we have got.
But what we also what we had before was a society that blamed women for being pregnant. Inevitably and always. I mean, I don't think you would be able to argue that.
I tend to blame men, and I've always thought of abortion as being men's liberation on a very large scale.
Well, I mean, I would argue.
I was a student in the early 70s. This is shortly after the 67 Act had come through. And I remember the reaction of a bloke I knew when news was brought to him that his girlfriend had become pregnant. You know what he said? Well, she's better start knitting booties then. He wasn't going to do anything about it at all.
Exactly.
His view was he had no obligations towards her whatsoever, and those obligations, such as they had been swept away by the 67 Act.
Well, but also
I always remember that. She'd better start knitting booties.
Something else.
Male liberation.
I would add something else, which is that I think the introduction of contraception and the pill created a huge problem for women, because then now there was the expectation that men could have sex with you and that it wouldn't be a problem for them. And I think that really also undermined women's ability to, have a relationship. I mean, when I was young in the 70s, 80s, it was expected that you would be taking the pill, because the boy didn't want to have to take any responsibility. And if you weren't and you got pregnant, it was your fault, not his.
Well, I don't know about that, but women were not ignorant of these circumstances. If you read Kingsley Amos's rather fine novel, Take a Girl Like You, much better than the dreadful Lucky Jim, which everyone goes on about, in which the main female character, Jenny Barn, is having an argument with her boyfriend who's pestering her for sex. And she knows perfectly well what's going on. He keeps paying her elaborate compliments. He's trying to get inside her. And she doesn't want him there because she doesn't want to get pregnant unless he marries her. And there's no question, both sides of the conversation know perfectly well in this pre-pill event what is going on.
The transaction is,
what's
exactly.
at stake.
Yeah.
No one's ignorant. And as a result, people say to me, but you're telling me that people used to not have sex because outside marriage? And I say, absolutely, they didn't. In some cases, they didn't want to. In other cases, they were scared of it. But whatever it was, there was a very strong taboo against it, which was enforced by society. And that was swept away. And the 67 Act was one of the things which helped to sweep it
But
away.
also, the advent of oral contraception made it impossible for women to say, no, I don't want to have sex before marriage. Made it harder, I should say, not impossible, but it made it much harder because there was no excuse for not having sex before marriage.
The reason for that is the people who actually invented the contraceptive pill intended that to happen.
Exactly.
There's a chapter in my book, The Abolition of Britain, which I recommend to everybody, even though it's 25 odd years old now, which deals with the history of the contraceptive pill and the very, very militant feminist persons who got together to make sure that it was developed. They knew it would have that revolutionary effect.
Yeah.
Abortion is increasingly medical rather than surgical. But for a long period when abortion was surgical, abortion involved in most cases a violent intrusion into the womb.
Of course, yeah. What happened last week is the ultimate sort of unintended consequence of that process that began with the introduction of the pill, in my view, because it becomes harder and harder and harder for girls, particularly young girls who perhaps aren't, in a very happy or healthy environment, to resist the pressures. And you can't put the genie back in the box. So we can't go back to a world where, as Kingsley Amos wrote, the woman is able to say no, because that's not where we are. So, but the idea that just because a baby, and you're correct to call it a baby, is still inside the womb means that the mother can assassinate it effectively, which is what we're talking about. We're talking about them. It's not okay for anybody else to kill it, by the way. And that's the other distasteful thing about this, which is that these Labour MPs and this woman, Tonia Antoniazzi, who's put forward this thing, they go, well, it's okay because it's only the mother who can kill it. It can't be a doctor or a third party, and they will get prosecuted if they do. It's fine because as long as the mother does it, that's okay.
I have to say, it was a very curious argument.
It's just an extraordinary situation and an extraordinary argument, which really makes me just think that the people in the House of Commons, they must just be idiots.
Well, I'm glad that it's shone a harsh light on the whole subject of abortion for many people who probably never considered it very much before. But if the real problem stems from 1967 and what followed, and I think that if people become more aware of what this thing involves, they might be less willing to countenance so much of it and also less tolerant of it.
The other thing I wanted to come back to briefly before we move on is the question that you raised earlier about adoption. I agree with you on adoption. Adoption should be a lot easier. There's an enormous amount of red tape around adoption. And in fact, one of the things that Michael Gove, my ex, was trying to change, because he was adopted himself, was to try and make it easier for people to adopt babies. If there was a better framework in place for women who don't want to have children because they're too young or they're not in a situation to give their kids up for adoption, I think the abortion rate would come down. I don't know.
It is odd, isn't it, to live in a country where adoption is incredibly hard and abortion is
exactly
pretty much on demand.
That's what I mean. What's wrong? That is wrong, right? I think just
strikes me as being the wrong way round.
It's just really the wrong way round. Anyway, let us know what you think. When we come back, Peter will be asking, should anyone really have nuclear weapons? Stay tuned.
Well, hello again. This is still, alas, Vine and Hitchens. I am Peter Hitchens and she is
Sarah Vine.
And what I would like to talk about now is nuclear weapons, whether anybody should have them at all. It's been very interesting watching the United States trying to explain to Iran that Iran shouldn't have nuclear weapons, whereas the United States should, and Israel should, and Pakistan should, and we don't really care about North Korea and who knows what. And one has to wonder what the actual logic is behind saying who can, who can't, apart from who's got them and who's biggest. And also whether actually they should exist. Apparently one of the earliest nuclear physicists, when he discovered that his work might lead to the creation of a nuclear bomb, disappeared. He just disappeared. He's an Italian. I'm afraid his name has escaped me, but it'll come back to you. He just disappeared. Nobody knew where he ended up. He was never seen again. And his colleagues thought that he probably did so because he realized what was going to happen if this research continues in the late 30s. It was obvious to many people how serious it was going to be. We have an elaborate justification for nuclear weapons in our minds. And I've been backwards and forwards. I went on CND marches when I was a 15-year-old campaigning against the bomb. I then became a fairly strong NATO enthusiast during the Cold War and was very much against CND because the logic seemed to me that it was ridiculous for us to get rid of ours while allowing the Soviet Union to keep theirs, which I still think is a perfectly sound argument if they exist. But it keeps nagging back at me, should they exist at all. There is or used to be a wonderful museum at Los Alamos in New Mexico, where the bomb was largely developed, which had a tremendous display in which the for and against arguments were put at that time. I haven't been there since about 1995, so I couldn't say what it looks like now. But over and over again, the argument is put, well, it saved hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of lives in 1945. We dropped the bomb on Japan, so they surrendered. We didn't need to invade, and all those people who would have died in the invasion didn't die. So great, that's fine. The trouble is, it's almost certainly not true. There's a very interesting book called Racing the Enemy by a Japanese-American historian called Tsuyoshi Hasegawa, who's also a fluent Russian speaker who was able, I think, for the first time to go through all the documents. And he pretty much concluded that Japan's surrender in 1945 was not caused by the Hiroshima or Nagasaki bomb, but by Stalin's decision to go to war with Japan and to invade Manchuria. The Japanese were terrified of a Russian revenge for everything they'd done to them since 1904, when they humiliated them at the Great Battle of Tsushima, and they thought, I think very wisely, if the war went on with Russia in it, they'd probably lose large parts of their territory to Russia, and they've lost some. They're very resentful of certain islands which are still in Russian hands, but they were really scared of that, and that was what persuaded them to surrender. These were not nice people. No, I don't make any case for them. They didn't care about the conditions of the Japanese civilians. They despised them for their weakness. They didn't mind when Curtis LeMay, of the United States Army Air Force, I think it was, then flattened and burnt to a crisp almost the whole of Tokyo, killing more people than were killed at either Hiroshima or Nagasaki. They didn't mind. They didn't mind that everyone was living on almost nothing but sweet potatoes because there was no food. They didn't care about that. So why should they suddenly have got all emotional about Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Well, they were emotional about losing territory, which is very, very sacred in Japanese mythology, and they were really, really worried about that. And I think that if that turns out to – there's further research obviously required. People can argue about these things. People still argue about who started the First World War. But if that argument isn't true, then we need to ask ourselves again, what was it for? One other small thing. A woman called Katherine Moar recently wrote a play about this called Farm Hall. A lot of the justification among the scientists who were working on the bomb was fear of Hitler. Right. They thought Hitler would get the bomb and we had to get it first. What happened at Farm Hall was we captured all the German nuclear scientists and we put them in a large house in Huntingdon and microphoned the place from top to bottom and listened to their conversations to find out how much they'd known. And the answer was that Hitler's scientists had got nowhere near a bomb. This was a complete fantasy. And just one other, and this is another book recommendation, a very fine novel by C.P. Snow, much despised now, I don't quite know why, called The New Men, which describes in some detail, as a novelist rather than history, but there's a lot of truth in it, the arguments among British nuclear scientists about whether they should go ahead with this project. And it was a big moral question, and we dodged it basically by pretending that we needed the bomb to stop Hitler and by pretending that the bomb was necessary to end the Japanese war. I don't think either of those justifications work, in which case, why have we got it at all?
Well, I don't know whether those justifications are correct or not, but I don't understand why we have it at all, because I think to myself, there are certain weapons that are considered to be illegal weapons, like certain gases, chemical weapons, certain types of bombs. And in my view, the nuclear bomb should be in that category. And if you have it, it should be diffused. I don't think it makes any sense for some nations to have it, some nations not. It's not a deterrent, because how is it a deterrent? Because obviously if one person uses it, then the other person uses it, and then everyone dies. So I can't see that it's a deterrent. I just think the entire world should stand down its nuclear arms and leave it at that, because I just don't think there's any point in them existing. And how can you stop a country from doing bad things by having a nuclear bomb hanging over them? They know you're not going to use it. It's pointless.
Well, I wouldn't make your declaration. I think it's impossible to get countries to disarm things of that kind.
But why? Why is it? Why can't there just be a NATO? Why can't there be a NATO agreement?
What would be the force?
Well, because you say
what would be the force to make them do it? They're not going to do it.
Well, because the thing is, it's a wrong thing to have. In the same way that it's wrong to use sarin gas or napalm, it's wrong to use a nuclear bomb. So if you can ban those things, why can't you ban the nuclear bomb? I don't understand.
It's like one of those wonderful 1950s American science fiction programs where a wise man comes from space and tells everybody to behave. He's not coming. This isn't going to happen.
Can't I be the wise man from space?
On the other hand, what we can do is we can have a much more rational conversation.
You can tell I grew up watching Star Trek, can't you?
Well, actually, I do believe, and there's a book to be written about this.
Because it was brilliant.
I do believe that Star Trek has had a huge political and moral influence on tens of millions of people who watched it in a rather soppy way, which
it's
I do not think has done all that much good. I'm a hard realist when it comes to war and weapons. I'm afraid.
But I believe in the Federation.
But even that having been decided, the problem with nuclear weapons is that they are unusable unless you start staring mad. Now we love to categorize.
So why have them in the first place?
Categorize our opponents as being mad, but they generally aren't. And I was alive during, I can't really remember because I think our parents and teachers kept it from us, the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the Soviet leadership at that time in 1961 were not very nice people, but they still had enough sense to know that if they launched those things, or if they precipitated the launch of them by the other side, then that was the end.
Well, that's what I mean.
And they didn't do it.
So that's my point. No one is ever going to use them. So why should anyone have them?
Well, but that's a sort of high general question, which, as I say, you can ask as often as you like, but it's not going. People are not going.
But couldn't we sit down?
Not going to lay there.
Couldn't NATO, your beloved NATO,
all people of good sense come together and do something sensible?
Yes.
Yeah, they could. But
couldn't your beloved NATO say,
they have
guys?
Never in history done so. So no, the ones that we have will continue to exist. But I think nobody
wants to rule over a wasteland.
Another small thing: the so-called conventional weapons, as developed since the Second World War, are of such horrifying power now.
I agree.
They can destroy. I mean, look at these so-called bunker busters. I mean, look at the weight of and concentration
and the drones now as well.
So the thing is that nuclear weapons, rather than preventing war, have increasingly permitted a lower level of war within certain constraints to take place. And the Ukraine war, who would have thought a war involving the Russian army could take place in Europe after the invention of nuclear weapons, and yet it is happening as we speak.
But let me just say to you. So, say we had a nuclear amnesty, like you have with knives in London. So we had a nuclear.
They're good too. They're really
okay.
effective.
No, don't be so cynical. Just listen to me. Say we had a nuclear amnesty, and everyone had a year to get rid of their nuclear weapons, and we put them all on the moon or whatever.
Moon, poor old moon.
Poor old moon. I don't know, somewhere. But the point is, do you not think that everyone would just breathe a massive sigh of relief and go, thank God we don't have to have these awful things anymore, which, by the way, are incredibly expensive to maintain. And as we've discussed in previous podcasts, you usually have to live 27,000 feet under the ocean in great big silos run by poor men who never get to see the light of day. I mean, do you think that anyone would resist? Maybe North Korea?
Oh, yes, I do.
So you think they cling on to them?
I absolutely think the governments of the major nuclear powers would resist like anything.
On what basis?
Well, that they don't want to be the first to do it, and they don't trust anybody else.
If you can't use it, what's the point of having it?
The whole of this Iran business has been about trust. The Israelis don't trust the Iranians, and the Iranians certainly don't trust the Israelis, and the Americans don't trust the Iranians, and they probably don't trust the Israelis either, but they're not going to say so. So that's why we're in this mess.
But I mean,
and the Israelis, when they built their bomb, they weren't very public about it themselves. In fact, it only came. Apparently, there was a cocktail party at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv sometime in the early '60s when somebody blabbed. An American diplomat picked it up, and that was the point at which they discovered that Israel was developing a bomb, and that the French had been helping them do it.
Yes.
How did that work out? And look at the history of how the Pakistani bomb came to be built as well. It doesn't. You start. The United States said, "Right, we're getting rid of our entire nuclear arsenal." So where would they put it? Do you know there are large areas of I think
Arizona,
of Rosyth and Devonport, which are full of parked nuclear submarines. Because they don't know what to do with the reactors.
So maybe we had
built in the 60s. They don't know what to do. So what do you do with an old nuclear bomb? Exactly.
Well, you could put it on the moon.
People can get to the moon. You will have noticed this.
Well, you mean people are going to go to the moon and try and get a bomb back?
Well, I don't know.
I mean, that's a bit mad.
Rule it out.
Okay, I see the thing is, I'm for full global nuclear disarmament. I'm sorry. I know that. I mean, the generals will hate me, but, I'm just a girl. That's what I think.
Oh, Sarah, don't betray yourself.
But you started out by saying that we shouldn't have what's the point of nuclear bombs? And now
I
I've come round to the point of view.
I'm so not an idealist. I don't think we can get rid of them. But I think that our future conversations about how we continue to store and hold them,
well, then either you give them to everybody or you don't have any at all.
Should be intelligent ones, not stupid, emotional ones of the kind that we have all the time.
But this is not a stupid emotional thing. It's a perfectly sensible reaction. We should not have no one should have a nuclear bomb, because if you have a nuclear bomb, A, you can't use it, because if you do, it's the end of the world, and B, it causes all sorts of other wars, as we've just seen between Israel and Iran.
Yes, but Pollyanna is not President of the United States, or indeed President.
Well, the more's the pity, that's what I say.
It's the people who occupy those positions are not like that.
Well, I just think it's time we had some more Pollyannas and a fewer angry men.
You're not ever going to get Pollyannas on both sides. If you've got Pollyannas on one side, then it will be the angry men who end up winning the quarrel.
Anyway, I don't know.
That won't work, but I just think that people should talk less bilge about it, that's all.
Nothing good comes out of these things. And like I say, you have lots of other illegal weapons. Why can't we just add nuclear bombs to that? Job done.
Well, have you noticed, though, that there was a great palaver about landmines, Princess Diana?
Yes.
You remember Pericolo?
Yes.
Landmines are okay again because of the Ukraine war. Quietly, they've been
rehabilitated.
But they have, in political terms, they've been quietly rehabilitated because they've turned out to be useful for stopping the Russians. And also cluster munitions, which everybody about 10 years ago saying we can't have these cluster munitions. Now we're supplying them to the Ukrainians.
Exactly.
It's these prohibitions melt away when necessity, or indeed opinion of the strong kind, comes into play.
Yes, but it's clear that we need some sort of Star Trek-like federation that can just oversee all of this stuff, probably run by me, and I can just tell everyone off and tell them not to have any of their things that they're not supposed to have.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Spock.
No, I think that's more Captain Kirk for you, actually. Mr. Spock would say it wasn't possible. In fact, I think in this context, I am Kirk and you are Spock.
No, it's logical, but unfortunately, like many logical things, it is impossible.
Who's the one who lives in the engines?
Oh, Scotty.
Yes, you're Scotty.
Scotty.
Yes. She cannot take it, Captain. Exactly.
I'm not going to try doing that. People will complain.
We have a treat for you to end the podcast with. One final email from a listener. And it's Daniel. And he says, I wanted to thank you for prompting a revisit to The Wind in the Willows. Growing up as I did in the 90s and having seen the 1995 animated film as a mere stripling, Badger always took on Michael Gambon's voice as I read along. On rereading the thing, I was forced to recast the role to Mr. Hitchens, our very own Badger. It would rather make my day to hear him read a passage or two aloud and really cement his position as the definitive Badger. Thanks once more. I shall look forward, as I always do, to the next episode. Peter, over to you.
No animal, according to the rules of animal etiquette, is ever expected to do anything strenuous or heroic or even moderately active during the off-season of winter. All are sleepy, some actually asleep. All are weather-bound, more or less, and all are resting from arduous days and nights during which every muscle in them has been severely tested and every energy kept at full stretch. Very well, then, continued the Badger, but when once the year has really turned and the nights are shorter, and halfway through them one rouses and feels fidgety and wanting to be up and doing by sunrise, if not before, both animals nodded gravely. They knew. Well then, went on the Badger, we, that is you and me, and our friend the Mole here, we'll take Toad seriously in hand. We'll stand no nonsense whatever. We'll bring him back to reason by force if need be. We'll make him be a sensible Toad. I have to tell you, this episode ends badly.
For Toad?
It does end badly, but it also ends badly for Badger.
It always ends badly for Toad.
Toad fools them. He gets away and then ends up in prison as a result.
Yes, I know. I love that. Pop, pop.
Poop, poop, if you don't mind.
Isn't it pop,
It's
pop?
poop, poop. Look, I know this book practically by heart. They're driving along the road in their canary-coloured cars,
Poop,
and so they're thrown off the road by a passing car speeding at an Edwardian maximum speed of 60 miles an hour. And the canary-coloured car is shattered, and the horse runs away, and Toad sits in the middle of the road, staring into the cloud of dust left by the car, and a dreamy expression on his brown face saying, poop, 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 poop. And from that moment onwards, he is in love with the motor car. Which I am not.
Well, yes, that's a whole other episode. Don't forget to check out this week's reading watch list and share the books, TV and films you think we might want to read or watch. For that or anything else, you can get in touch via email, alas@mailonline.co.uk. You can leave a comment on Spotify or send us a voice note on WhatsApp, 07796 657 512, and start your message, please, with the word alas.